He walked into that hearing like it was his stage. Every step heavy with the kind of confidence that only comes from believing the room belongs to you. JD Vance had that grin sharp, self-satisfied. The grin of a man already rehearsing his victory clip for social media. He didn't glance at the audience, didn't even acknowledge the press row. He didn't have to. He believed they were already his. The cameras tilted toward him, hungry for drama, and he could feel it, like heat on his skin. He adjusted his jacket as if he were about to give a State of the Union, not face a woman he thought he could embarrass. In his mind, the story was already written. He'd toss a cutting line, Jasmine would stumble, the crowd would laugh, and the internet would do the rest. Every politician dreams of that moment, the viral soundbite, the clip replayed on every screen, proof that they were the smartest person in the room. And in that second, JD Vance believed he had it. He believed the day would end with him celebrated, retweeted, applauded by the people who love a good takedown. But the room was alive in a different way. There's a pulse in these hearings, a kind of invisible current that decides who it will favor. And as he sat down, that current didn't bend toward him. It was quiet. Yes, but not the quiet of surrender. It was the quiet before a storm. The type of silence that doesn't flatter you. It studies you. He placed his hands on the table like a man presenting himself to the world, already picturing the camera flash freezing him in victory. But the air didn't move. The cameras didn't cheer. The walls themselves felt like they were waiting, holding their breath. He thought it was his stage. He thought it was his day. He didn't know he had just walked into a trap that didn't need to snap because it had already closed around him the moment he smiled. He waited for the perfect pause, letting the silence stretch like an elastic band ready to snap. He leaned forward, elbows pressing into the table, the microphone catching the faintest scrape of his movement. His smirk didn't just appear, it grew, curling slow and deliberate, like he wanted the entire room to watch it form. His eyes flicked from the committee to the cameras, to the sea of phones in the gallery, and then back to Jasmine, locking on her like a predator announcing its hunt. "Congresswoman," he said, drawing the word out like a taunt, like he had spent all morning rehearsing the syllables in front of a mirror. His voice oozed with the smugness of a man who thought he had already won. "You seem very confident," he continued, pausing, letting the word hang, feeding the room a taste of what he thought would be humiliation. "In your intelligence." He let that land, the smirk widening, the pause stretching, as if daring anyone to interrupt his little performance. His fingers tapped once on the desk, perfectly timed with the rise in his own anticipation. The room didn't laugh. It didn't gasp. It waited. And he fed on that silence, mistaking it for fear, mistaking it for the kind of tension that made him the center of gravity. Then he leaned even closer, his voice dipping just enough to feel like a challenge. "Maybe you'd like to take an IQ test?" he said, letting each word slice through the air. He paused again. He loved the pauses because he believed pauses gave him power. He could almost hear the edit he thought the news stations would make. JD Vance, the clever disruptor, cornering the congresswoman. He spread his hand like an open invitation. "Right here," he said. His smirk hardened into a grin. "Right now." For a split second, he imagined the clip trending. He imagined the retweets, the memes, the victory lap waiting for him on cable news. He didn't notice the way the air shifted, how the silence wasn't fear, it was a fuse, lit and burning, waiting to reach the dynamite he had just handed to her with his own words. The room shifted, almost imperceptibly, but enough for anyone paying attention to feel the air tighten. It was the kind of change you don't see, you sense it in your chest first, in the way your pulse notices before your eyes do. The marble walls seemed to grow taller, the lights overhead a little harsher, casting long, tense shadows across every face. The audience murmured, a low hum that wasn't quite excitement, wasn't quite disbelief, but a strange, electric mix of both. A few people leaned forward, their elbows finding the edge of the benches, trying to get closer to whatever was about to happen. Phones rose like sunflowers, turning toward light. 100 tiny lenses glinted, as if the walls themselves had grown eyes. The first few had been raised when JD Vance started talking, but now they were steady, ready, capturing every twitch of his smirk, every micro-expression on Jasmine's face. The cameras in the back panned slowly, like predators circling, sniffing for the exact moment the story would explode. JD Vance had tossed his challenge into the air like a coin he was sure would land on heads. He had thrown it down like a stone into a still pond, expecting ripples that would echo his dominance across the room. He imagined the murmurs growing into laughter, the reporters tweeting about his boldness, the soundbite already cutting itself together in his head. He waited for panic to bloom in her eyes, for her to fumble, for the pond to splash back against her and prove his point. But the water didn't ripple the way he thought it would. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that surrendered, it was the kind that watches, that waits, that pulls back before the strike. And somewhere in that pause, even if he didn't recognize it yet, the weight of the room had already started to tilt away from him. The cameras weren't just hungry for his victory anymore. They were hunting for something bigger, something he didn't see coming. Jasmine didn't flinch. Not a muscle betrayed her. She didn't shuffle the papers in front of her or glance around the room for allies. She didn't even clear her throat. She just sat there, still as stone, and let the moment stretch until it became something alive. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, blooming into every corner of that hearing room, like a slow, inevitable tide. Every second that passed was a statement, louder than any outburst could have been. JD Vance's smirk faltered for the briefest instant, a flicker you'd miss if you blinked. He was waiting for her to fill the air, to sputter, to rush, to give him the chaos he could twist into victory. But she didn't. She just existed, like the silence itself belonged to her. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't hide hunts. It stalks the room, climbs into the heads of everyone watching, and forces them to ask, what does she know that he doesn't? The gallery began to fidget, a cough somewhere in the back. A camera zoomed in tight on Jasmine's face, the glow of the lights catching the sharp calm in her eyes. Reporters stopped typing. Even the microphones, those little red blinking eyes, seemed to lean closer. The stillness wasn't passive, it was predatory, and the longer she stayed in it, the more it swallowed JD Vance's moment whole. By now, the silence had become a mirror, reflecting his own bravado back at him. His word sheaths proud, taunting challenge hung in the air with no applause to hold them up, sagging under the weight of their own emptiness. He could feel it, though he didn't understand it yet. He had walked into a trap without realizing it wasn't a trap. She said it was a trap he built for himself. Vance chuckled, low and smug, like the sound of someone stepping on a stage they thought they owned. The laughter wasn't for the room, it was for himself. A man performing to the mirror he carried in his own mind. See? He said, letting the word hang in the air like a gavel he thought he could swing. That hesitation. His voice dripped with the kind of confidence that doesn't come from truth, but from the belief that cameras bend to the loudest man. That's what I mean about low IQ leadership. He leaned back just a fraction, tugging at his cufflink with the flourish of a man who had already engraved his own victory in the headlines. But the room didn't laugh with him. Not one person smiled. The sound of his chuckle fell flat, swallowed by that same predator silence Jasmine had crafted like a weapon. The air was heavier now, not just still but charged, like the crackle before a storm. His words clung to the walls, sticky and desperate, and in the spaces between, everyone felt the shift. Jasmine hadn't moved, and that was the part he couldn't comprehend. No flinch, no frown, no flash of anger. Her stillness was louder than his mockery. Every camera, every phone, every single eye in that room turned toward her, not him. Even his allies glanced nervously, waiting for the punchline he thought he had already delivered to land. But it didn't. It hovered in the air, brittle and fragile, like glass about to shatter. Vance tugged his cufflink again, a small, nervous tell now hidden beneath the performance. His smirk twitched, just slightly, the edge fraying as he realized the applause he had been expecting wasn't coming. Instead, a slow awareness began to creep through the room. He had swung first, but the room wasn't with him. They were waiting, watching, leaning toward Jasmine like flowers turning to sunlight, ready for whatever she would say or not say next. And in that moment, without speaking a single word, she had already begun to win. Winning has a sound, and JD Vance didn't hear it. There was no polite laughter, no scattered applause, no approving nods from the allies he counted on. Instead, the air turned dense, almost physical, like walking into a room where someone had just whispered a secret that could ruin lives. The silence wasn't empty, it had weight, sharp edges, a pulse that quickened with every second he tried to hold his grin. Even the soft hum of the lights overhead seemed louder than his confidence now. The pause was not a gap, It was a verdict forming, slow and certain, and it pressed against him from every direction. Camera operators, those quiet hunters of human truth, sensed it first. Their movements slowed, frames tightening, lenses drinking in the tension. One panned deliberately to Vance's face, catching the microsecond where bravado faltered, while another drifted toward Jasmine, frozen in perfect stillness, like marble carved to wait out storms. That stillness was not passivity, it was strategy. The kind of poised quiet that made people lean forward without realizing it, hungry for what would break it. Whispers fluttered at the edge of the room, not the sound of excitement, but anticipation. The audience knew something bigger than a cheap IQ stunt was about to detonate. The air crackled with it. Staffers shifted in their seats. A cough somewhere in the back was instantly swallowed by the heavy quiet, like even sound itself knew better than to intrude. Vance, for the first time, seemed to feel the hollowness under his own performance. His fingers brushed that cufflink again. But this time it wasn't a flourish, it was a tick. A reflex for a man who could sense control slipping through his hands. The cameras caught it, that twitch of reality breaking through the theater. In that silence, the win he had rehearsed in his mind evaporated. The room wasn't his stage anymore. It was hers, and she hadn't even spoken. Jasmine finally spoke, and the room felt it before anyone heard it. Her voice was smooth, deliberate, almost soft, but it carried like a scalpel cutting through velvet. "An IQ test?" she said, letting the words linger in the air. Not a question, not a reaction, a diagnosis. She tilted her head slightly, a slow, measured movement that drew the room into her gravity. "That's an interesting choice." The pause that followed wasn't dead ere it was alive, coiled, making every ear stretch closer. It floated above the room like smoke curling from a match, delicate but dangerous, hinting that fire was near. Phones hovered higher, a sea of glass catching the fluorescent light, desperate to record the first spark of something viral. Staffers who had been scrolling, whispering, half asleep were now locked in, their stillness as telling as their stares. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath, zooming tighter, the lenses hunting for the flinch that hadn't come yet. Jasmine didn't rush. Her stillness became the story, a living contrast to the frantic energy of Vance's smirk and fidgeting hands. She let the echo of her own words stretch out, as if the air itself had to acknowledge them before she moved on. Her eyes scanned the committee slowly, methodically, like she was assessing a room full of students who had all just failed a test they didn't know they were taking. The faintest smile, a grin, not a smirk, just a flicker of knowing touched the corner of her lips. "You know," she continued, softer now, each syllable like the first tap of rain on glass, "an IQ test is a measure of patterns, of memory, of problem solving. But it doesn't measure judgment. It doesn't measure integrity. And it doesn't measure timing." That last word landed heavy, sharp, deliberate, a word that tasted like a warning. The room shifted again. Someone coughed and immediately regretted it. The front row leaned forward without meaning to, drawn into the quiet violence of her poise. She didn't need to raise her voice, because she owned the silence. And in that silence, JD Vance's challenge began to sound like the last thing he should have ever said. Without raising her voice, Jasmine reached for her folder, and the entire room seemed to lean with her. It wasn't rushed, not a hint of panic or defense. Her hand moved like water, slow and inevitable, the kind of motion that announces, "I am not afraid of you." There was no fumble, no shuffle of papers like she needed to find her place. She already was the place. The folder was just a prop in her theater, and every pair of eyes in that chamber became her audience. The air thickened, that charged heaviness that only comes before a storm. Even the cameras seemed to inch closer, their silent lenses waiting to devour whatever was about to surface. She didn't look down as she opened it. Her gaze stayed fixed, steady and unshaken, like she had all the time in the world and everyone else was just borrowing it from her. The leather flap bent back with a whisper, and the faintest glint of paper appeared a flash of cream against the deep wood and muted suits. JD Vance shifted in his seat. Just a twitch, barely there, but it was the first crack in his performance. He had come in swinging with arrogance, but now, with every slow second she owned, his confidence was being stripped away in public view. He drummed his fingers once, stopped, and clasped his hands like that would make the cameras forget. Jasmine's hand slid inside and withdrew a single sheet of paper with the care of someone disarming a weapon. She didn't even glance at it before holding it at her side, as if the weight of it alone could bend the air. "You see," she began, her tone smooth, almost conversational. "There are tests you don't study for, tests you don't even know you're taking, until you fail them." A ripple ran through the audience, barely a murmur, but thick enough to feel like static crawling across the skin. Staffers froze in their chairs. JD Vance, for the first time, didn't look like the man who thought he'd already won. He looked like the man wondering if the room had already decided he'd lost. She pulled out a cream-colored envelope, sealed and thick, the kind of envelope that doesn't just hold paper, it holds weight. Secrets, consequences. She didn't rush. Her fingers brushed the edges like she was touching something alive, something that could bite if mishandled. Then, with a casual flick of her wrist, she tapped it once on the table. Just once. Soft. But in that charged room, it may as well have been a gavel slamming down. The sound was quiet, almost polite, but it traveled like a whisper through stone. People heard it in their chests more than their ears. JD Vance's smirk twitched, just for a heartbeat, the first hairline fracture in his armor. He tried to swallow it back, forcing a half smile, but the cameras caught that flicker the micro expression that says, "I might have miscalculated." Jasmine didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Power doesn't beg for attention. It takes the room by existing in it. Her hand rested on the envelope like a lion on its prey. Around her, the air stilled. Even the low hum of whispered side conversations died. Staffers stopped fidgeting with their pens. A phone buzzed and was silenced immediately, like someone feared the vibration itself might break the spell. "Funny thing about envelopes," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "People assume they're just paper, but sometimes they're mirrors." She tilted it slightly, letting the overhead lights glance off the seal, a tiny glimmer that might as well have been a blade catching sunlight. The audience leaned forward without realizing it. JD Vance blinked, trying to mask his sudden stillness with a lazy lean back in his chair. But his fingers betrayed him, tapping once against the table, stopping when he noticed. He was waiting for her next move, and everyone knew it. That envelope had become the entire room's heartbeat. She drummed it lightly against the wood again, softer this time, almost playful. "This one," she continued, "has been waiting for a very particular moment." Every word rolled slow, like she was feeding the room oxygen one syllable at a time, and nobody dared breathe too loud to take it from her. "This," she said, raising the envelope so the lights caught its edge, "is a letter from your alma mater." Her voice didn't waver. Her hand didn't shake. She held it up like an artifact dug out of the earth, something fragile but damning. The cameras zoomed in, lenses hungry, trying to drink in every detail. The cream-colored paper practically glowed under the fluorescent lights, and the little embossed seal on the flap made it look like a relic of judgment. "It was sealed," she continued, and the room leaned in. She wasn't just saying it, she was reminding everyone that whatever was inside had been untouched, unmanipulated, waiting for this exact second. "I had it verified." Each word landed like a careful nail in a coffin, slow, deliberate, inescapable. People in the front row stopped blinking. Even the soft creak of a chair, shifting in the back, felt loud. JD Vance tilted his head, that practiced smirk fighting to stay alive, but his eyes betrayed the calculation happening behind them. He wasn't grinning now. He was measuring, recalling, scanning a decade back in his memory to 2012, that year, that clerkship. That one opportunity he had turned into a talking point in every polished speech. "And it concerns," Jasmine said, her voice lower now, almost intimate, "your application for a clerkship in 2012. The year hit the room like a dropped chandelier. It was too specific. Too sharp. Someone in the audience gasped, not loud, but audible. A murmur rippled across the chamber, phones tilting higher, catching angles, live feeds pinging notifications like fireworks. Vance blinked once. Slow. His throat moved. He was still smiling, technically, but it was the kind of smile a man wears when his skin is 2 sizes too small. His cufflink hand twitched against the table before he stilled it. Jasmine didn't look away, didn't blink, didn't rush. She let the silence bloom again, feeding on the oxygen of every unasked question, every half-breathed. "What's in that letter?" Even the walls seemed to lean closer, hungry to hear the words that would cut through the air next. Vance leaned back in his chair, shoulders pressed against the leather like he owned the room, but the performance cracked at the seams. He tried for casual, that practiced "I'm unbothered" posture, the one meant for cameras and campaign ads, but his body told another story. His fingers betrayed him first, just a flicker, a restless twitch against the polished wood of the desk. The sound was nothing, a ghost of a tap, but in a room this tense, it may as well have been a drum. His knuckles shifted again, then stilled, then moved once more, like his own hands weren't sure if they wanted to fight or flee. The smirk was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't confidence anymore. It was armor, a shield made of thin glass that only looked solid from a distance. The edges of his grin wavered, pulled too tight, revealing the faintest hint of teeth, as if forcing a smile could somehow hold back the tide swelling against him. His jaw worked once, slow, a controlled clench, but the cameras saw it. They always do. Every little movement became amplified in that silence. His slight lean, the twitch in his index finger, the subtle rise and fall of his chest that told the world he was breathing faster than before. He glanced toward his left, just for a second, maybe to a staffer, maybe to no one at all. But that glance said everything. What does she have? How bad is it? Can I still spin this? The room had turned on him in the quietest way possible. Not with shouts or jeers, but with attention. Total, merciless attention. Every lens, every pair of eyes, was watching him unravel thread by thread. Even the air felt heavy now, like it was leaning on his shoulders. The tension didn't need noise, it was the absence of it that gutted him. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't rush. She let him live in that silence. Let him fight his own thoughts. Let the smirk keep failing in microscopic cracks. And somewhere, deep in the corner of the room, a camera light blinked red, recording the precise moment JD Vance stopped looking like a predator and started looking like prey. Jasmine's fingers moved with the kind of patience that could kill a man's ego before she even spoke. She broke the seal with a soft tear that sounded louder than it should have, every ear in that room tuned to it like it was a gunshot. The paper slid free, crisp and deliberate, catching the light as she unfolded it. Every corner creased like a countdown. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The slower she moved, the faster Vance seemed to unravel. She held the letter in both hands, her eyes scanning it as if confirming something she already knew. The room leaned in, not physically, but emotionally, like every heartbeat was waiting for the drop. And then it came, her voice cutting through the air with surgical calm. "According to this," she said, each word like a pin puncturing the quiet, "your application was denied." She let the pause stretch, a single heartbeat of mercy before the blade went deeper. Twice. The word didn't just land, it detonated. Twice. It echoed without sound, ricocheting off polished walls and into the bones of everyone present. A whisper rippled through the back rows, the kind that grows without anyone daring to speak. Twice wasn't just a number, it was a wound. It was humiliation with a date and a signature. JD Vance froze, every muscle pretending stillness, but his eyes betrayed the storm. A flicker, a flash of calculation. His lips parted like he had a defense ready, but nothing came out. The cameras caught all of it, the slight twitch in his cheek, the faint swallow in his throat, the way his grip tightened on the desk's edge as though he could anchor himself to dignity. And in that moment, the letter became more than paper. It was a mirror, reflecting a truth he couldn't swat away with charm or bravado. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, didn't need a gavel, didn't need the crowd. That single word twice was the sound of a throne cracking. It was like the entire room forgot how to breathe at once. A collective inhale, sharp and jagged, filled the chamber with a sound that wasn't sound at all. It was tension made audible. Reporters, their fingers frozen above keyboards, looked up like schoolchildren caught off guard, mid-scribble. Pens hovered, cameras zoomed in tighter, and even the interns who thought they'd seen it all leaned forward, wide-eyed, sensing history crystallizing in real time. The fluorescent lights seemed to hum louder, the air conditioning suddenly too cold, too present. JD Vance's smile was still there, technically, but it was no longer a weapon, it was a shield made of glass, and everyone in that room knew it was cracking. His eyes darted not frantically, but searching for some invisible handhold, some lifeline that could pull him out of the silence that Jasmine had turned into a vice around his throat. He had come to humiliate, to orchestrate the viral moment that would crown him the master of the room. But the energy was no longer his. Jasmine had done something worse than refute him. She had rearranged reality. His smirk was now an artifact, a fossil of a man who thought he was in control 30 seconds ago. Even the cameras seemed to understand the shift, gliding closer with reverence, capturing every micro-expression like rare wildlife in the wild. The journalists in the front row exchanged glances that didn't need words. This is the clip. This is the headline. The stage had been his, but without raising her voice, without even leaving her chair, Jasmine Crockett had redrawn its lines. She hadn't just dodged his trap, she'd lifted it, flipped it, and placed him squarely under it, letting the bars drop in slow, cinematic silence. And the room knew it. You could feel the knowing ripple, from the marble floors to the top balcony, like electricity passing through an invisible wire. He wanted spectacle. She gave him a reckoning. The words landed like a slow-moving avalanche, soft at first, but unstoppable once they began to fall. Jasmine didn't rush. She let the syllables breathe, stretch, and settle in the room, each one wrapping itself around JD Vance like a tightening coil. Your judgment, she repeated, and the echo wasn't just in the acoustics, it was in the faces staring back at him. The phrase had weight, history, and teeth, and every journalist in the room could already see it as a headline. Vance blinked, once, twice, but his usual smirk didn't return. It was as if his brain had briefly betrayed him, replaying a memory he didn't want the world to see. The conversation behind closed doors, the mentorship that soured, the quiet warnings that maybe he wasn't ready. He shifted in his chair, the leather creaking like a confession, his hand unconsciously brushing the cufflink he'd adjusted earlier with so much confidence. It was no longer an accessory. It was an anchor. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, not as an attack, but as if gravity itself was on her side. It wasn't about how smart you were, she said, her voice soft but merciless. It was about how reckless you were willing to be when you thought no one was watching. Her tone had the calm precision of a scalpel, cutting without drawing blood, leaving the wound invisible but undeniable. The room was frozen in that suspended reality where time felt stretched, where every breath seemed louder than the last. A single reporter coughed, and even that sound felt like blasphemy against the cathedral of tension Jasmine had built. The camera lights reflected off the envelope in her hand, a silent reminder that this wasn't a threat, it was documentation. A record. A mirror held up for the world to see. And Vance knew it. His lips parted like he might speak, but nothing came out. Not yet. Because intelligence could be defended with numbers, with tests, with arguments. But judgment? Judgment was naked. Judgment was the quiet sum of every choice you've ever made. And in that moment, under those lights, in front of those cameras, JD Vance's judgment had just been read aloud to the world. The words hung in the air like a knife spinning in slow motion, and the room collectively leaned into the edge. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, didn't rush the sentences. He let each syllable drop with the weight of a gavel. "Would you like me to read the part?" she said, pausing just long enough for every camera to lock on her face, where he wrote, "Mr. Vance demonstrates a pattern of emotional instability under pressure." The sound of that quote was louder than any shout could have been. It didn't echo off the walls, it echoed off him. JD Vance froze in his chair, every muscle caught between fight and flight, but there was nowhere to run. His smirk died first, leaving behind a face that didn't know whether to feign outrage or pretend indifference. His fingers twitched against the wood of the desk, a small tell that the cameras caught instantly, zooming in like predators on the scent of fear. The gallery reacted like a single living organism. A sharp inhale, a soft, scattered murmur. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," and it rippled across the rows like wind through leaves. Even the reporter hardened, cynical, desensitized, sat straighter, their pens hovering just above the page, knowing that a moment like this doesn't happen often. A real mask slipping. A real fracture caught in real time. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't need to. The power wasn't in the letter itself, it was in the silence she weaponized around it. She held the paper steady, a single sheet that suddenly felt like a verdict, a lifetime of JD Vance's bravado, funneled into one fragile sentence. He tried to swallow, his Adam's apple betraying him in a slow, uneven bob. And for the first time all afternoon, the room saw him as he was, not as he wanted to be seen. No one dared break the spell. The camera operators stopped breathing, almost afraid the sound of their own movement might disturb the sacred gravity of the moment. Jasmine's eyes didn't waver. They didn't need to pierce, they just saw. And in that stillness, the truth became heavier than the walls themselves. It was the kind of ripple that feels like the air itself is shifting, like the walls are listening, and the floor is suddenly unsteady. A murmur rolled across the gallery, soft but electric, the sound of disbelief mixing with quiet delight. A few gasps slipped through the tension, sharp enough to slice the silence. People weren't just watching anymore, they were witnessing. Even the most loyal allies, the ones who usually nodded and clapped on cue, were suddenly busy with anything but his face. One scrolled through her phone like she was hunting for an emergency that didn't exist. Another leaned toward a staffer, whispering nonsense just to look occupied. No one wanted to make eye contact with JD Vance. Not now. Not when the illusion of untouchability had cracked open in front of them like an egg on marble. The press section froze, mid-keystroke. A single journalist's finger hovered above the spacebar, knowing whatever came next might make history in a 30-second clip. The sound techs shifted in their seats, adjusting their headsets like they were tuning into a frequency that wasn't just audio, it was the pulse of the room. The tension was almost physical, a weight pressing down on every shoulder, a hum beneath the skin. Even the camera operators, trained to stay detached, found their lenses creeping closer, hunting the smallest tremor in Vance's hands, or the twitch at the corner of his mouth. And he knew it. That was the worst part. JD Vance knew the cameras were eating him alive in high definition. He knew that every second he didn't respond was another second the narrative slipped from his fingers. His jaw tightened, then loosened. He tried to muster a smirk, but it came out crooked, like a mask sliding off mid-performance. The room could smell it. The fear, the pride, the collapsing bravado. No one needed to speak. The silence had a language of its own, and it was spelling out the word exposed in letters too big to ignore. It was the kind of silence that didn't just sit in the room, it stalked it. Vance's lips parted, but his voice had betrayed him, hiding somewhere behind his ribs. The cameras caught every millisecond of that hesitation, the tiny quiver at the corner of his mouth, the way his tongue pressed against the roof of his mouth, as if trying to shape a word that refused to be born. For a man who'd built his entire persona on fast retorts and practiced charm, this was unfamiliar terrain. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, loaded, and merciless. It judged him. It weighed him. It made him smaller with each passing second. He glanced down at the table, then up at the gallery, as if searching for an anchor. But the room offered none. Every set of eyes that met his seemed to say the same thing. We saw it. His hands twitched once, a barely there spasm, before gripping the edge of the desk. He could feel the heat rising to his face, the blood pounding in his temples. In the stillness, even the air felt sharp, like 1,000 needles pricking against his skin. His reputation had been a shield for years, and now it was paper thin, dissolving in real time under the weight of that single, unrelenting pause. The microphones caught the smallest inhale, the half-second of breath he pulled in, like he might fight his way back with a joke or a jab. But nothing came, not a syllable. And the silence god, that silence curled around him like smoke from a fire he'd started himself. It didn't forgive. It didn't move. It was the sound of a man realizing he'd written a script for a scene he no longer controlled. Even the click of a camera shutter felt louder than his courage. The letter lay there like a live wire, humming in the tension only she could hear. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. Her stillness was its own kind of thunder. Her palm lingered on the page, fingers spread, claiming the space, the moment, the narrative. You wanted an IQ test, she said again, softer now, almost a whisper, but sharper than a blade. I brought the truth. Each word was a strike, deliberate and inescapable. She leaned just slightly toward the microphone, not to perform, but to let the weight of her words settle over every ear in the room. One of these things follows you. One of these things matters. The effect was instant. The press row leaned forward in perfect, involuntary unison, as if pulled by gravity toward the wreckage about to unfold. Phones hovered higher, fingers poised but frozen. The audience, packed with lobbyists, aides, and a handful of spectators who'd stumbled into history, didn't breathe. Jasmine let the pause expand, let it cut deeper, because the longer it stretched, the heavier it became. Her eyes found his not with malice, but with something worse. Certainty. It was the look of someone who already knew how the story ended. JD Vance's smirk had evaporated into something raw and human, a thin line of confusion, and dread crossing his face. He shifted in his chair, the leather squeaking under his weight like a betrayal. His hand twitched toward his water glass but froze, because reaching for it would look like weakness, and doing nothing looked worse. Every movement was a confession now. The cameras loved it. They drank it in, capturing not just a man in trouble, but a man undone in slow motion. Jasmine's tone didn't change. She didn't need to press harder. The truth had already done the work. An IQ test measures numbers, she said, letting the words settle like dust after an explosion. But this? Her fingers tapped the paper once, and the soft thok echoed like a judge's gavel. This measures character, and character doesn't need multiple choice. The room absorbed it, and the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was damning. It was the sound of a man's bravado collapsing in on itself while the world watched. It was a weight you could almost touch, the kind that crawls up your spine and settles in your throat. The room didn't need sound to scream. It pulsed with the raw electricity of a moment too big to ignore. Staffers froze mid-step, gripping their clipboards a little tighter, as if moving might shatter the air. Reporters had stopped typing altogether, fingers hovering above keys, staring like they'd stumbled into the kind of story that would define careers. Even the cameras seemed to lean in, their lenses glinting under the fluorescent lights, hungry to swallow every flicker of expression, every tremor in the air. JD Vance shifted again, barely, and that tiny motion rippled through the silence like a spark in dry grass. His jaw tightened, a vein pulsed in his temple. He looked less like the senator who strutted in, ready to humiliate someone, and more like a man who had just realized the trap he thought he set was his own. Every breath in the room felt synchronized, shallow, waiting. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink, didn't rush. She let the weight of the room press down on him, letting the silence itself become her witness. The truth she had laid out didn't need a speech. It was alive now, circling him like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. It was the kind of moment that splits history in two. Before and after the moment, a grin dies, a reputation cracks, and the entire world seems to lean forward, just to catch the sound of the break. Vance leaned forward, elbows pressing into the polished wood like he could anchor himself to something solid, but it was useless. His body moved, but his confidence didn't follow. His mouth opened, a faint tremor on his lips, yet the words refused to cross the threshold. They gathered behind his teeth, bitter and heavy, choked by the same air that now felt too thick to swallow. A man who thrived on being loud, on commanding space with sound, was suddenly held hostage by silence. The cameras feasted on it. One lens zoomed in tight, catching the quiver in his jaw, the way his eyes darted for an escape that wasn't there. His hands twitched near the microphone, fingers curling like they wanted to grip something, anything, that could give him back control. But there was nothing to hold on to. Not the smirk he came in with. Not the arrogance he had worn like armor. The room had stripped it all away. A bead of sweat traced down the side of his temple, glinting under the lights, and the audience felt it the unraveling. The man who came in swinging was now a portrait of stillness, but not the kind that commands respect. This was the stillness of someone cornered, the stillness of a story collapsing in real time. You could feel the collective inhale of the room, every heart waiting for the sound of a single word that might save him, redeem him, remind them all of the fighter he claimed to be. But there was nothing. Only that trapped, silent weight behind his teeth, heavy as shame, louder than any insult he had ever thrown. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She didn't even blink longer than she had to. She just existed, a calm, unshakable force at the center of the storm he had tried to summon. Her posture was perfect, not rigid but rooted, like she had grown into the very floor beneath her. She didn't need a smirk, or a gesture, or a single extra syllable. Her stillness spoke louder than any speech he could have prepared. It told the whole room, without words, who owned this moment. Every camera tilted toward her, as if the lenses themselves understood that she was now the axis of gravity. JD Vance had arrived certain that the spotlight belonged to him, but now it bent toward Jasmine like iron filings to a magnet. Reporters leaned in, pens hovering, breath held, as if afraid to break the spell. Even the faint hum of the lights above seemed to soften around her, the air shifting in quiet obedience. Her calm wasn't passive, it was a verdict. The kind of calm that only comes when truth doesn't have to shout to be heard. She became the still point in a spinning room, an anchor that every eye returned to. The weight of the silence wasn't empty anymore, it was hers. She carried it like a crown, while he sat drowning in it. And in that moment, everyone watching inside the hearing, on the screens, and across the internet felt the same realization sink in. The stage he built had turned into her courtroom. The camera zoomed in, and suddenly, the world could see the truth his words couldn't hide. JD Vance's hands were clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone pale, the veins rising like fault lines under strain. The cufflinks gleaming little trophies he had polished for the spotlight looked pathetic now, like decorations on a sinking ship. He had adjusted them earlier with the swagger of a man in control, the kind of man who thought image could replace substance. But under the harsh lens of a silent room, they were nothing more than props in a play that had slipped from his grip. His fingers twitched once, a tiny betrayal that no one missed, because silence turns the smallest movements into confessions. He tried to shift his weight, but even that looked like a retreat, a man trying to disappear into a chair too small to hold the weight of his ego. The longer the camera lingered, the more the illusion of power drained from him, like color bleeding from an old photograph. Every viewer at home could feel it, that subtle, almost cruel unraveling. This wasn't the confident senator-in-waiting he wanted them to see. This was a man suddenly aware of his own skin, of the heat crawling up his neck, of the eyes of millions watching a moment he couldn't control. The cufflinks caught one last glint of light as he shifted his hands, but it wasn't triumph anymore. It was a quiet, metallic echo of the defeat he couldn't cover. The moment the room stopped being his stage and became his cage. The moment stretched out, wrapping itself around the room like a slow, tightening coil. Nobody dared to breathe too loud. It didn't need yelling, because the silence itself was roaring. It didn't need theatrics, because the truth had already stolen the spotlight. Every face in that chamber seemed to hang in suspension, caught between disbelief and reluctant awe. Reporters who had come ready for sound bites and chaos now found themselves frozen, their fingers hovering over keyboards, because they understood instinctively. This was the story. JD Vance shifted once, a slight movement of his shoulder, but it felt like a tremor in a room carved from stone. His earlier bravado-those smirks, that rehearsed superiority, was gone, replaced by a hollow stare that couldn't quite land anywhere safe. He knew it, and everyone watching knew it too. A man could talk his way around anything until the truth walked in holding receipts. And today, the receipts had a name, a date, and a silence sharp enough to slice through ego like glass. Even the cameras seemed hesitant to move, afraid to break the spell. One lens caught Vance's jaw clenching, another focused on Jasmine, unmoved and steady, the calm center of a storm she hadn't even needed to raise her voice to summon. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone equally, leaving no room for spin, no place to hide behind volume or performance. It was one of those rare, unrepeatable instants where the air itself carried judgment, and the truth spoke louder than any insult ever could. And the longer it lingered, the louder it became. Jasmine finally leaned back, and the chair's faint creak was the only sound anyone could hear. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It came out low, smooth, and sharp enough to slice through the marble walls. "Some tests," she said, every syllable deliberate. "You don't take with a pencil, you take them with character. And you—" She paused, letting the silence settle like a blade on the back of every neck in the room. "Just failed yours." The words didn't echo, but somehow, they felt louder than any shout could have been. Vance's smirk evaporated completely, leaving behind a face that finally looked human, tired, cornered, and unprepared for the gravity of his own challenge. His fingers twitched once against the desk, a small, betraying gesture that told the whole story. Across the room, a reporter slowly lowered his phone, almost reverently, like he'd just witnessed a car crash in slow motion. A few staffers avoided looking at each other, because locking eyes would mean admitting they had all just seen the same thing. A man dismantled without a single insult, without a single scream, just truth, clean and surgical. Even the air seemed to hold still, as if it didn't want to move until it understood what had just happened. Vance shifted, as if reaching for words somewhere in the wreckage of his confidence. But nothing came. The cameras drank it in, zooming close enough to capture the slight tremor in his jaw, the tightness in his throat. He had walked in expecting applause, expecting to control the room, expecting to leave a headline hero. Instead, he was now part of a moment that would outlive him, a cautionary clip destined to replay over and over, long after the lights went down. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. She didn't lean forward or deliver another blow. She just let the quiet claim the room, because that's what power looks like when it doesn't need to prove itself. And that was how it ended. No shouting, no debate, no grand speeches or last-minute comebacks. Just a man, a letter, and a silence that spoke louder than anything he could ever say. The room seemed to hold its breath, frozen in that suspended moment, as if time itself refused to move forward until it had soaked in the lesson. Reporters' fingers hovered above their keyboards, not typing, just absorbing. They already knew the story had written itself. The cameras, still rolling, captured everything: the crease of the letter, the tremor in JD Vance's jaw, the way his eyes darted for an escape that didn't exist. Somewhere in the audience, a cough dared to break the spell, and even that felt too loud. Vance leaned back slowly, as if lowering himself into the weight of his own defeat, the leather of his chair groaning under the shift. He didn't look at Jasmine. He couldn't. Her presence was a mirror now, reflecting everything he had tried to project and everything he had just lost. That envelope, ordinary and silent, had become heavier than a gavel, heavier than any verdict. It was proof. It was memory. It was the kind of truth you can't out-talk. By the time the hearing officially moved on, the room had already chosen its headline. Not in words, not on paper yet, but in the collective pulse of every witness. The moment was sealed, like the envelope that started it all. And the man who had walked in hunting for a viral clip had gotten one, but not the one he wanted. The cameras didn't need him to speak anymore. His silence was louder. His stillness was the story. And somewhere, far beyond that room, the internet was already waiting to crown the victor of a battle that ended before he ever found his next line.